Thank you for joining us this evening for the launch of the analysis conducted by the Asian Australian Lawyers Association into cultural diversity in the legal profession, with its focus on the representation of Asian Australians in the senior echelons of the legal profession. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Reynah Tang and I am the President of the Association. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands in which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also acknowledge the many distinguished guests who join us tonight as leaders of the profession. Associate Justice Rod Randall from the Supreme Court of Victoria, Ms Jane Reynolds, representing the Chief Justice of the Family Court, Dana Bryant-Ayo, Judge Suzanne Jones from the Federal Circuit Court, Chief Magistrate Peter Lauritsen from the Magistrates Court of Victoria, our guest speaker, Mr Rudy Monteleone, Director of the Victorian Multicultural Commission, Mr Michael McGarty, Legal Services Commissioner and CEO of the Legal Services Board, Mr Richard Besley, CEO of the Council of Legal Education and Board of Examiners, Ms Jo Kirby, Executive Director of the Victorian Law Foundation, Mr Greg Reinhardt, Executive Director of the Australian Institute of Judicial Administration, Mr James Peters, QC, President of the Victorian Bar, Ms Katie Miller, President of the Law Institute of Victoria, Mr Vincent Morfumi, QC, Acting President of the Australian Italian Lawyers Association, and Ms Sherry Ong, Board Member of Multicultural Arts Victoria. I'd also like to thank Baker & McKenzie for becoming a sponsor of the Association and for hosting tonight's event. We'll hear from other partners, Mr Alex Wolf, a little bit later on. Before I get into the detail of the analysis, I wanted to set the scene by relating the story of Mr William Arquette, an Asian Australian pioneer in the legal profession. Mr Arquette was born in Wangaratta in 1876, the son of Marquette, who arrived from what was then known as Canton during the gold rush, and his wife, Inong. After completing his secondary education in Wangaratta, Mr Arquette studied law at the University of Melbourne. He appears to have been a good student, winning a prize from the Supreme Court in 1902, although there is some debate whether this was the Supreme Court prize or related to his articles, which was served under Mr Richard Cross of the firm then known as Maddock & Jamison in 1903. The photo on screen is from his time at Maddox. You can see him there in the top left corner. He then joined the Victorian Bar, reading with Stuart MacArthur, who later went on to become a Supreme Court judge, and became the first Chinese barrister to practice in Melbourne, if not Australia. An article about him in the Victorian Bar News of winter 1984 records that he enjoyed an excellent general practice and was recognised as an able cross-examiner with a superb command of language. However, as Sir Robert Menzies, who was a friend and practiced with Mr Arquette in Selborne Chambers, observed, a certain prejudice among clients against having a Chinese barrister to an extent limited his practice. Despite this, the search of Ostley reveals that between 1905 and 1928, he appeared before the High Court on no less than 12 occasions. Relevantly, this included a number of cases, Bishop and Chung brothers, Potter and Minahan, Ingham and Hai Lee, that involved challenges to legislation that discriminated against persons of Chinese origin. Indeed, as his daughter Toi Lan noted in a paper on her father, this was an issue he was passionate about, having been involved in forming a committee to agitate against the Immigration Restriction Act 1901 and the unreasonable conditions it imposed, such as the infamous dictation test. Among other achievements, he was co-founder and president of the Australian Chinese Association, and in 1903 he was appointed Acting Consul General for China in Melbourne. It appears that Mr Arquette had diverse interests, including being a founding member and Grand Master of the East Caulfield Masonic Lodge, and was a life member of the MCG with a strong enthusiasm for cricket. Sadly, despite his apparent success and some 30 years at the bar, Mr Arquette was never appointed a King's Counsel, as many of his fellow barristers at Selborne Chambers were. Which brings us to our analysis of Asian Australian cultural diversity in the legal profession in Australia. When our association was first launched in 2013, I observed that while the number of Asian Australians coming through our law schools has been increasing for some time, this did not seem to be reflected in senior echelons of the legal profession, in terms of partners in our law firms, in terms of members of the bar or the judiciary. To date, that perspective has been largely anecdotal, for the simple reason that unlike countries like the United Kingdom and New Zealand, very little information is collected regarding the cultural origins of those that make up the legal profession. Interestingly, one statistic we do have is that some 10.75% of the solicitors in New South Wales were born in Asia. One would expect the percentage of solicitors with Asian cultural origins would be even higher. It was in order to address this gap in the data, we formed a group of committee members and volunteers to review the publicly available information regarding our law firms, barristers and judicial officers, to gather data on the level of Asian Australian participation. I would like to acknowledge and record my thanks for the many hours work put in by that group, as the people are listed on page 2 of the report, without which this analysis could not have been completed. Being a practicing lawyer myself, I obviously need to start with a disclaimer. As the research has been based on limited public available information, the analysis is fairly rudimentary and far from scientific. For instance, it's hard to know if the family of somebody with the surname of Li hails from Guangzhou in China, or is from the Lees of Shropshire. Accordingly, you should not rely on it without obtaining appropriate legal advice. Nevertheless, I'm confident that the picture is clear, namely that Asian Australians are underrepresented in the senior echelons of the legal profession. The first graph summarises our research, comparing the proportion of Asian Australians in our community at 9.6%, with a proportion that are partners in law firms with more than 10 partners, that are barristers, or that are members of the judiciary. It is apparent that the level of Asian Australian participation in the senior echelons of the legal profession is low and diminishes as one moves up the ranks. Moreover, both the bar and judiciary compare unfavourably with the corporate sector, with research undertaken by the Diversity Council of Australia on the corporate sector showing that 1.9% of ASX 200 senior executives have Asian cultural origins. The good news is that there are some promising signs in our legal firms. The average percentage of Asian Australian partners across firms of 10 or more partners is around 3%, with larger firms of 40 plus partners doing slightly better than firms with 10 to 40 partners. And significantly, there are some firms that stand out. For instance, 5 out of the 25 partners at Lavin Legal in Western Australia have Asian Australian heritage. And at my firm, Johnson, Winter and Slattery, some 8.2% of the partnership is comprised of Asian Australians. Indeed, things would be even better, but for a small number of firms which had no Asian Australian partners at all, which just goes to show we can't afford to be complacent. However, when we turn to the bar, the picture becomes a bit more grim. It appears there are less than 100 barristers from an Asian Australian background in the whole of Australia, representing a measly 1.5% of all barristers. It is, of course, quite possible that it is because Asian Australian lawyers tend to prefer life as a solicitor to the cut and thrust of the bar. But one has to accept that it's equally possible that it may be the product of the lack of support for these Asian Australians that seek to be advocates or appropriate role models to inspire them. And of those 93 Asian Australian barristers, only 6 located in New South Wales, South Australia and Western Australia have managed to achieve silk. In 5 jurisdictions, including Victoria, there is not one Asian Australian senior counsel. To echo the words of Julius Sumner Miller, why is it so? I recall that when post-nominals were being debated, one argument in favour of the reinstatement of QC was that it was necessary to allow our barristers to compete in Asia. But do we think this is likely if we continue to deliver up a senior bar with a largely monocultural face? Last week, I was invited to Comedy Zone Asia, a special initiative of the Melbourne International Comedy Festival, which brings together comedians from Asia to perform at the festival here. The MC, Vivek Mabulani, a Cantonese-speaking Indian comedian from Hong Kong, made an amusing observation about the complete absence of Asian zombies on The Walking Dead. He reasoned that at least so far as Jainists or Buddhists are concerned, it must be because, even in zombie state, they would still refuse to eat animal flesh. But stepping back from the comedy, there is, of course, a serious point to be made about the lack of Asian faces in our mainstream media, and it is likewise at the senior bar. and with apologies to my friends that are senior counsel and a few tonight, it might be said that members of the senior bar are the zombies of the legal profession. Is it any wonder then that our judiciary is, to coin a phrase, largely pale, male and stale? As this slide shows, for every 100 judges, there is less than one from an Asian Australian background. It is pleasing to hear that the Council of Chief Justices has in recent times established a Judicial Council on Cultural Diversity under the chairmanship of Chief Justice Wayne Martin of the Supreme Court of Western Australia. I understand that it includes diversity champions from all jurisdictions and levels, including Justice Sevilis Kairu from the Supreme Court of Victoria, who some may recall spoke at the launch of our association. Based on a recent speech given by the Chief Justice Martin, it appears that the focus of the Judicial Council is to help the judiciary develop its cultural capability in order to deal with the increasing diversity of those who come before our courts. It will also seek to address the special needs of the Aboriginal community that are disproportionately represented in the criminal justice system in Australia. While those steps are important and are to be commended, I would hope the Judicial Council would also consider the need to ensure that our judiciary is, to use the adjective of former Federal Attorney General Mark Dreyfus, appropriately reflective of the community which it serves. Comments made by the Victorian Attorney General, the Honourable Martin Defoe MP, at our Lunar New Year celebration last month, gives us some reason to be hopeful that we will see improvement on this front over time. For as Chief Justice Martin observed in his speech, although Australia's judiciary is a more diverse group than it once was, the age, gender and cultural characteristics of Australia's judiciary remain quite different to those of the community generally. An older age profile is understandable. The differences in gender and cultural background are more difficult to justify and explain, given that women have comprised the majority of graduates from our law schools for many decades now, and the cultural profile of our law graduates has moved closer to the cultural profile of the community. Of course, some may question why diversity should matter, given that our judges are, in any event, duty-bound to judge without fear or favour. In a 2014 blog on cultural diversity in the Australian judiciary, Mr. Ray Steinwall, General Counsel of Nevada's Pharmaceuticals in Australia, answered that by referring to comments of former High Court Justice Michael McHugh, who said that when a court is socially and culturally homogenous, it is less likely to command public confidence in the impartiality of the institution. Mr. Steinwall went on to add, also a diverse judiciary allows legal argument to be received by those who bring differing perspectives and experience to bear on the issue. Ultimately, Mr. Steinwall concludes, if Australia is to play a leadership role in the Asia Pacific that is the fastest growing in the world, there is an urgent need to improve diversity on the bench to reflect the contemporary society that it serves. So where to from here? As mentioned at the outset, our analysis has been limited because it is based on the limited public information available. It means, for instance, that we have not been able to look at law students, in-house counsel or tribunals. I would like to see a broad and national diversity survey of the legal profession undertaken, perhaps by the Law Council of Australia, which I don't think should be limited to issues of culture or to Asian Australians, but rather examines the diversity of a profession across all elements: gender, culture, sexual orientation, disability, and perhaps even socio-economic status. If this was to occur, then there would be more meaningful data. Assuming that such a survey is undertaken and confirms our analysis, then we need to examine the causes of and solutions to the underrepresentation of Asian Australians. Research conducted by the Diversity of Council of Australia in the business sector suggests potential barriers to Asian Australian progression include cultural bias and stereotyping, westernised leadership models, the lack of relationship capital, and the case for culture not being understood. I would anticipate similar issues in the legal profession, which may well be exacerbated given the conservative nature of the profession and its tendency to lag behind developments in other sectors, as evidenced by the continuing issues faced by women in the profession. So we see that our report today is merely representing the start of a necessary and important dialogue. I thank all of you, and especially the leaders from across the profession, for attending today, and I hope that we can count on your support in seeking to progress this issue over the coming years. Of course, it would be remiss of the association to simply sit on its hands, waiting for more research to be conducted and the world to change. In this regard, we are already working on a range of programs calculated to improve the participation of Asian Australians in the legal profession, including through a mentoring program that matches members with successful barristers, solicitors and judges to provide career guidance and support. And I just pause there to acknowledge and congratulate the Honourable Justice Michelle Gordon, one of our mentors, on her appointment to the High Court of Australia today. We also run a CPD program which will be focused on improving the soft skills of our members, such as our forthcoming seminar on the 25th of May, where Mr. Jason Yap, OAM, lawyer, property developer and philanthropist, will talk on the importance and benefits of active community involvement. And soon we will launch an Asian Lawyers Directory, currently being developed with the generous support of the Victoria Law Foundation, which will provide the public with details of the language, legal and cultural capabilities of our members. In addition, to honour the pioneering work of Mr. Arquette, we are currently considering the establishment of a scholarship program for emerging Asian Australian legal talent.